everyone, welcome to my brand new Christmas is Coming series. This is all about batch making cards. So I'm going to show you some simple card ideas that you can batch make so that you have a huge pile of cards by the end of November ready to send out in December to all your family and friends. So decide how many cards you want to have at the end of the month and divide it by 5, and that's how many you need to make of each of the card designs as you find them posted on YouTube. So this is the last video in this series for this year, and I definitely learnt that I need to be much more prepared in preparing videos as well as preparing Christmas cards, but I've got there in the end. This is the final video, and I probably would think that about now it's maybe useful for next year, but you never know, you might have a little special card that you want to do. This design is a little bit more intricate than the other designs that I've showed you, but it still could be batch made. So perhaps you've got a few special people in your lives that you want to make something a little bit different for. This is the card design for you. So I'm also including rubber dance stamps, or I'm using rubber dance stamps for this tutorial because I just felt that I wanted to do one more rubber dance video before Christmas, and this is it. So you can substitute similar stamps that you may have in your collection if you want to, or check out the rubber dance stamps over at rubberdance.com. I'm using these Pine for You stamps, and you could use similar stamps that you might have in your collection, and I'm also using one of the Christmas greetings from Rubber Dance. So decide how many cards you're going to make and make that many card bases. So these bases measure 5 3/4 inches by 11.5 inches, and I'm scoring them and folding them in half at 5 3/4 inches to make a square card base. I'm using cream cardstock because I'm going to be decorating the card base with my stamps. Now each of the cards is covered with a piece of red cardstock that measures 5 3/4 inches square, so I've cut a piece for each of the cards I'm making. Then I've cut a lacy square out of the centre of each. This is the largest die in the lacy squares set. It's a Spellbinders die, and you could use a similar die that you might have in your collection. So I just attached it to the centre of each of my squares and then run them through the Cuttlebug to remove a lacy square from the centre of each of these red squares. Now the reason that I've done that is to save some money, because only the very edge of this square is actually going to show, so I can cut my red frame out of the inside and be very thrifty indeed. So you can put your lacy squares to one side and you can attach the remaining piece of cardstock to the front of each of your cards. So I'm using my PVA glue to do this, but equally you could be using some double-sided tape if you want to. I'm trying to get my glue very close to the edge of the card because I want it to look as if the actual card front is red rather than cream. So just making sure I just run a little bit of glue around the edges, and then I'm going to attach each piece of red cardstock to the front of my card bases. So just making sure they line up nicely, and I will trim off any excess with my scissors if my squares aren't completely cut to size. So now my card front, to all intents and purposes, started out as a red piece of card. The reason I've chosen to do it this way is so that the inside of my card is cream, which makes it much easier to decorate, and you will see how I tackle that a little bit later on. I've stuck each of my scalloped squares onto my card fronts, and then I've just checked to make sure that everything fits, and anywhere I've got a little bit of extra card I'm just trimming it away with my scissors. Next I've cut 5.5 inch square pieces of cream cardstock ready to stamp the card fronts, and I'm using Forest Moss Distress ink and a little branch of fir, and I'm just randomly stamping it all the way around the outside edge of each piece of card. So just twisting and turning my little stamp as I go, and looking at this first stamp now, you could quite easily use this as a feather, and I'm avoiding the centre because I'm going to cut that little piece away. And you're going to repeat that stamping on each piece of card for however many cards you're making. And then when I layered this up with the red layer I already have on the card, I felt that this pattern needed a little bit of red bringing into the background. So I'm just using the end of a paintbrush as a stamp, and I'm just creating little groups of 3 dots. I know it looks like holly berries, and actually I have fir branches, but it's just enough of a little touch of red to add a little something to the pattern that I've already created. And you want to repeat that process for each of your card fronts. Then I'm going to ink the edges of each of these decorated panels with some Forest Moss Distress ink, and I'm using an ink blending tool in order to do this. And I'm just taking the green ink from my mat onto the edge of my card. So you can see most of the ink is sitting on the mat, and I'm swirling from the mat onto the edge of the card. And that way we get a nice darker ink on the edge of the panel and blending out to a slightly lighter tone towards the centre of the card. So starting always off the card on the mat and then swirling as if you were polishing a surface, the ink onto the surface of the card. And you're going to repeat that process for each of your card fronts. And this just finishes off the edge of the design and makes it look like a little piece of printed cardstock. And to finish off these panels, they need just a little touch of glitter. So I'm taking my heat gun and making sure the Distress ink is sealed. So that's heat setting the ink. Distress ink likes to stay wet a little bit longer than other inks. So if you want to perhaps add glitter or something similar that might stick to the ink, it's probably better to heat set the Distress ink first. So I'm just giving a little light blow over with the heat gun before moving on to add the glitter. So I really only want a very small touch of sparkle to these cards, and I don't want them to be too blingy. So I'm using my Distress glitter. So this is a rock candy glitter, so it's clear. It almost looks like sugar when it's on. And I'm just colouring over those little red dots with my glue pen, and then I'm going to add the glitter to those dots. I'm doing it in sections. So I'm almost doing a side's worth of little dots. Then I'm adding that little sprinkle of glitter, and you probably won't even be able to see it on camera, but I've just caught each of those berries with a little sugar dusting of glitter, and I'm going to do that for each of the card fronts. Make sure that when you're adding the glitter you're working over a piece of scrap paper, because it makes the whole process of tidying up that glitter much easier. Just put a little bit of a fold into the piece of paper, and you can then use it as a funnel to put all those pieces of spare glitter back into the pot ready for the next card. The next step is to make the frames that will go around the shaker section of our cards. And we're going to do this by removing the central section of each of our lacy squares that we die cut at step 1. So I like to use my Tim Holtz ruler for this. It's got a metal edge. I've got a lovely sharp craft knife. Be careful of your fingertips on that ruler. And I'm just running the grid of the ruler at 1/4 of an inch along the edge of the lacy square. That's not the very outside edge, but the actual solid square itself, and rotating the square to cut all 4 sides. And you may need to just put your knife into the corners of each of those squares just to release the central section. So line up your ruler at 1/4 of an inch and cut along that edge to remove the centre of each of your lacy squares. Once we have our lacy squares on the table, it's worth taking some thin, strong, double-sided tape and running them around the underside. So if you've got a right side and a wrong side to your die cut, this is on the reverse of your die cut frame. Now it may well be that you could have die cut your frame with a plain square in the centre, but I don't actually have any plain squares, so that's why I resorted to the ruler and craft knife method. next thing I needed to work out was how big an aperture to cut into my card front to create my open shaker card. So first of all, I started out by tracing the inside of the lacy square frame that I've created onto the card front. Then I cut a piece of card slightly bigger than that square, but slightly smaller than the actual frame. And that's the size of aperture I'm going to create on my card front. So it's working out for this card just slightly over 3¼ inches. And you can see here the aperture will be hidden by the front of the frame. The next job is to centre that template on the front of your printed piece of cream cardstock, and I'm going to be using my ruler to make sure that I get that aperture centrally on this piece of cream card. So I'm measuring the frame around the outside of the piece of cream cardstock and moving it until it sits exactly in the centre. And then once I was happy it was in the right place, I just took a pencil and drew around the outside of my template. Careful not to move your template. And that marks the position of the aperture that I want to cut with my craft knife. So these steps are all about accuracy and making sure that you place your ruler on the line, hold it still and steady, and then use your craft knife to remove that centre section from each of your stamped pieces of cream cardstock. And you can use that as a template to remove the same section in your card base. Make sure you remember to open your card before you cut out the window in the card front. So now everything should match up when you put your pieces of cardstock back in place, and you're going to repeat that for each of your cards. So now I've got my little template. I can line it up on the card that I've already cut and draw around it and remove that panel, and it's easier than keep lining up the square template that we cut in the first instance. I'm just using my craft knife to get into those corners to remove that centre section. Position the piece of card on your card front, making sure that it's evenly spaced, and then open up your card and remove the centre section. Now, because I'm creating a shaker window rather than just a shaker card, I'll be able to see right through the front panel, so I need to decorate the inside of the card. And in order to do that, I want to create myself a little mask so that I can ink what will become the central panel you can see through the window shaker, as well as inking the edges of the card. So what I ideally want is to be able to ink through the front piece of cardstock, but since they're pieces that we're going to be using on the actual card, I just want to create a same size piece as I've got here. So I'm just going to trace around it and cut it out to create another window section that I can use as a mask on the inside of my card. So I'm just tracing around the card front and then I'm going to cut it out. I need this to be slightly bigger than the original window so that the inking comes from slightly further towards the outside of the card. You'll see what that means in a moment. It's a little bit difficult to actually describe, but I'm just putting my ruler on the 1/4 of an inch mark so that the window that I create is a 1/4 of an inch bigger all the way around. I can remove this section because I don't need that. And then I'm working my way all the way around the outside of my square to create my mask. So placing your mask on the inside of your card, so line it up so that it's central and so that when you do your inking it can be seen through the card aperture on the front. And then using the Forest Moss ink, you're going to ink from the frame towards the inside of the card. And doing it this way means that you can fade the ink out towards the centre of the card, and that's where I'm going to be stamping the greeting for this card. Then to make sure that blends out nicely, I'm just taking a clean piece of foam and I'm using that to blend that inside edge into the centre. So you'll be able to see a nice graduated inked square as you look through each of the apertures. So you're going to repeat that process for all of your card bases. So inking first from the cardstock frame to the inside of the card, and then taking your clean piece of foam and just blending out the ink towards the centre. So for the next step, I'm going to ink the edges of all of the inside panels of the cardstock. This time I'm just going to catch the edges very lightly with the ink just to finish off that internal section. So I'm lightly inking around the outside edge and not forgetting to go along the fold on the inside. So you can see as this card is more complicated, it's still easy to break it down into steps, but within each of those steps you've got several smaller steps. So I've already inked the internal section of my card front, then I inked the outside, and now I'm putting the stamp in the middle. So peace on earth, this season and forever. This is a rubber dance Christmas greeting, and I'm using my Festive Berries Distress ink to stamp it in the centre of the insides of each of my cards. So I'm keeping the actual window closed so I can centre it in that aperture. So you can see it's still possible to batch make more complicated cards, and you'll find that within the larger steps you'll be breaking things down into smaller steps. So I've stamped my greeting, I've inked the insides of the cards, and now I'm going to add a little bit of fur for the extra decoration. Now I wanted those fir branches to be able to be seen through the aperture as well as on the inside of the card. And I'm just using a post-it note to make sure I don't get any on the places where I don't want them over the fold. So I'm literally going to stamp each of the corners of my inside of the card with the branches of fir, and then I'm adding some of those little red berries exactly as we did on the front. So I'm using the end of my paintbrush and some Festive Berries Distress ink to add a little bit of colour, and you can see how you can see those little pieces on the inside when the card is closed. So repeating that step on all of the inside pieces of your cards. So I've cut my pieces of acetate so that they fit inside my frame, so slightly bigger than the aperture that we've created. And then I'm going to be using the double-sided tape that we added way back in these steps to each of our frames, and I'm going to be using that to attach the acetate to each of the frames to create our first layer of window. You can see I've started to keep each of the elements of my cards together now, and I am attaching each of those acetates into position. And you can see they're just slightly smaller than the actual frame itself. Once you've done that for all of your frames, then you can add another layer of double-sided tape on top of the acetate, ready to create the little frame that we will build up to give ourselves enough room to add some elements that we can shake about on the inside of our window apertures. Then it's time to attach the printed layer to our cardstock. And I'm using double-sided tape to do this, but you could use glue if you wanted to. And I'm adding first a piece of double-sided tape around the aperture on the front of the card. And I will add another acetate square that's been cut slightly bigger than the aperture on the card base. And this creates our double glazing, if you like. So we've got another piece of acetate in place. Make sure it's all nice and clean as you work, so once this is all sandwiched together your window doesn't need washing. I find I get a lot of problem with dog hairs sticking to the acetate because it's very static. So I've added double-sided tape around the very edge, outside edge and the inside edge of this stamped card front, and then I'm attaching that centrally and taking it off again because it wasn't centrally and trying that for a second time. That's better. Luckily I managed to get that tape off because it's quite a strong double-sided tape, and eventually once we've built up our window section we'll be able to attach the frame. So again I'm adding the second layer of double-sided tape to my framed window so that that is ready for the next step, and then I'm attaching the card fronts and this second piece of acetate. So that's the frame ready, and then I'm going around ready to attach the second piece of acetate. Almost invisible on camera. And then this time I'm doing a little trick that my mum showed me, where you pull off only a small section of each of your pieces of tape so that you can get hold of them. Then you can line them up. I'm going to show you this in slow motion because it's probably worth seeing it in slow motion. And then you can see I'm pulling those pieces of tape away, and I haven't had to try and wrestle the piece of card off the top of the card front. So showing you that tip again in slower time, I'm just releasing the ends of each of those strips of tape and then just folding it so that I can get to it once I start to lay the card front down. So I'm literally just putting my finger on top to create a little fold. So I'm just releasing sections of the double-sided tape. This is perfect for people who are not very good at lining things up, particularly if you're using strong double-sided tape. Then you've only got little bits of stickiness to worry about. Once you're happy, you can press down on those corners and then just pull on those little pieces of backing tape and Bob's your uncle. And that card front is attached nice and straight, and we're ready to create some depth to our shaker card. So to create the depth for the shaker elements of this card, I'm just cutting very, very narrow strips of chipboard. So I've just cut myself a little pile roughly to the size of the frame, though we will be trimming them as we go along. So using that first layer of double-sided tape that we put on, I'm adding a chipboard frame just to the actual red section of my frame. I don't want it to show inside the acetate, and I'm taking my time to make sure that there are no gaps in my frame. So the second layer I'm adding with glue, and again I'm just trimming my pieces of chipboard to make sure that I get a nice neat, tight fit around this frame, because if you've got any holes in this little raised section, you will have escapey shaky bits. And no matter how lovely and glittery they are, you really don't want them all over your table, so that there is no shake left in your shaker card. So take your time and create a double layer of chipboard around the frame, starting with double-sided tape, then adding glue for the second layer, and making sure you take time to trim that chipboard so that you've got a nice tight fitted raised section, if that makes sense. You also want to make sure, before you move on to the next step, that all your acetate is clean on both sections, so on the card base and this frame that we're working on here, and that there are no pieces of stray tape, etc., sticking to the acetate, and that your glue is dry, because you don't want all your shaky bits sticking to the glue on the edge of your frame. So in preparation, I've already added a layer of double-sided tape around my built up frame. I'm cleaning off any spare bits of flotsam and jetsam that may have attached itself with the static to the acetate. Now, because I want a really frosty look to this shaker, I'm using some iced diamond from Pinflair, which is almost like a crushed glass, and it is really good in the fact that it's not too static, so it doesn't completely stick to the acetate. And I'm adding a little pile of that to the acetate that's already attached to the card base, and I'm adding another little amount of micro glass beads, again because they shake about without sticking too much to one place. If you use glitter, you'll find that it sticks to the acetate and doesn't actually shake. So I'm going to be really careful as I'm doing this, and I'm going to be using a spoon to add the little micro beads, and I'm just sitting them on top of the pile of ice diamond that I've already created, so I don't get too many of those little micro beads running away. And the trick is to work out on your first card by sort of counting the sizes of spoons that you're going to be using. I did think I might put some little red beads in there, but I decided not to. As you'll see, my little red beads were a little bit too big, so I'm not going to be using those. You want to have enough glitter that you can shake it about, you can see it when it's standing up, but it doesn't completely obliterate the work that you've done to the inside of the card. So I'm starting out with that little pile there. So I'm moving everything out of the way, and now I need to sandwich that with my little lacy frame. So this is a little bit tricky, like I said, because things do want to fly about, particularly those little micro beads. So I'm removing the tape from the back of my frame, and then I want to line it up with the aperture that I've already created. It's taking me a little while to get rid of the backing tape off my frame. Again, you need to make sure that that tape that you put around the frame all meets, because if it doesn't, if you've got any holes in that tape that you're going to attach to the card front. The reason this is taking me a while is because off camera I am removing and blowing little bits of fluff from the actual frame before I attach it down. So I'm using the piece of green cardstock that you can just see in the bottom left hand corner as a dark background to be able to see whether or not I've managed to get rid of all the fluff from the inside of my frame. You can see here I'm about to actually get it on camera. Hold on a second, and there it is. So I've checked that the acetate is clear, and now I'm going to remove the backing tape. And final step coming up, you're going to flip that frame over and sandwich those shaky bits in between the two panes of acetate. And that's your shaker card complete. So you should be able to move your little frosted elements around and still see them once the card is in the upright position. So just showing you through those steps once more. Make sure that your acetate is nice and clean, particularly between the two layers. I'm using a darker piece of cardstock so I can more easily see the tiny bits of fluff that may have attached themselves to the acetate. Now I've made sure that my double-sided tape is fixed all the way around the edges of my frame. And then I'm adding my micro beads and ice diamond, carefully measured, to the centre of the card. Then I'm removing my double-sided tape I've just added a little dot of glue where the tape's lifted away, and then sandwiching those little sparkly shaker pieces. Now the front looks really pretty, but I wasn't too happy with the inside, so the final step is to create yourself another set of those lacy frames, so exactly the same as you did in step 1, or was it step 2? No, I think it was step 2. You created some lacy square frames, and I'm attaching those to hide the inside workings of those shaker cards, and it just finishes this card off nicely. It really is a lovely card design, so you definitely want to spend that little bit of extra time to make sure the inside looks as nice as the outside. And there you have it. This probably took me an afternoon to get all these pieces complete. A nice lazy long afternoon, but I hope you agree that this is worth it, and it is a really nice and special card to give to your family and friends this Christmas. So there you have it, the last in my Christmas is Coming series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I wish I'd been a little bit more organised and finished on the 1st of December, but that's what it goes like at this time of year, as I'm sure you know. If nothing else, this series will sit here and be at the perfect start for somebody when they want to make their Christmas cards next year. It also turned out to be a rubber dance tutorial because the stamps that I've used on this card are all from Rubber Dance, and if you want to check those out, please pop over to rubberdance.com. There's lots of lovely stamps over there, and lots of creativity on the Rubber Dance blog from myself and my fellow teammates who are all busy creating with these fun and fabulous stamps from Rubber Dance. So today is December the 16th, not long left now, and I do hope to get my computer into the menders, so I'm not sure how many videos I will get to you before Christmas. I did hope to get 2, maybe 3, but I'm not too sure. In the meantime, I would just like to wish you and your families a very Merry Christmas. Hope Santa brings you lots of crafting goodies and puts them in your stocking so that you have fun creating over the holidays. And I look forward to sharing more videos with you very soon. Don't forget, if you like this video, hit the subscribe button, the like button, the share button, and I will be back with you again sharing more creativity very soon. Thank you for watching. So click on this link if you want the dimensions for the cards in this card series. So no matter what time of year it is you want to make a start on your Christmas cards, click on this link for all the dimensions listed nice and easy in one spot on my blog. Just want more Christmas card ideas? Click on this link and you'll find lots of alternatives on this Christmas card playlist. And last but not least, perhaps you want to click here and find some more sort of home decor Christmas projects like this pretty altered clock. And I hope that I've inspired you to get creative for Christmas, and I look forward to sharing more videos with you very soon.